Hello, Combi Nation. My name is Subi Sadeh. I've spent over a decade in medical device, pharma, and combination product development. Our industry feels complicated sometimes. Drugs, devices, clinical trials, submissions, sterilization, validation, design control, risk management, market access, reimbursement. The list goes on. My goal is mastery, so this podcast is to ask questions I have to people who may have the answers. Each week on the Combinate podcast, I talk to someone about their area to further understand and simplify. Whether you're a pharma person trying to understand the next wave of products, or a device person trying to navigate a pharma system you're unfamiliar with, or a newbie in both areas, I invite you to listen, and together we can simplify by combinating.
So the FDA has what's called compliance programs that lay out the roadmap for their inspectors to come in and do inspections, and specifically compliance program 7356 is their compliance program for doing combination product inspections for both device and drug-led combination product sponsors or their suppliers. So it lays out what is the scope, what is considered a combination product manufacturer, what are different types of inspections that can be performed under this compliance program, and then laying out what are the things that they're going to be inspecting. So it's different sections is the scope, it's what are the different types of inspections, and then what are the applicable regulatory requirements, so the call out provisions under there. And then it gives a little bit of what is the FDA's expectations and thinking on these requirements. For example, Part 4 for drug-led streamlined approach has 6 call outs: management responsibility, supplier controls, design controls, CAPA, and then servicing and installation, which in a lot of cases, servicing and installation are not applicable. And then it talks about what are the requirements, and then what is the interpretation that FDA is looking at when going in to perform these inspections. And then it talks about the different types of inspections. So is it a pre-approval inspection? Is it a surveillance inspection? Is it a for-cause inspection? Is it a post-approval inspection? So it talks about the type of inspections, and then what the inspector is looking for and how they can write up observations. So for example, for Part 4, drug-led, you can be inspecting for the 211 requirements and then the Part 4 call-outs. But for example, and this is something I try to explain when I do mock audits, is that I use process validation as a good example. Process validation from a device or combination product standpoint is still applicable, even though it's not one of the Part 4 callouts. It's analogous to 11 requirement, but you look at it through the lens of a device or combination product. But when the inspector writes up an observation, they have to reference the 211 requirement because it's not one of the the 820 callouts. So it explains that as well. But I like it from a training standpoint or a mock pre-approval inspection standpoint because it lays out what to expect. It also gives a definition that was not in Part 4, which is definition of combination product manufacturer. The definition is in Part 4, but what it says in the compliance program that's not in Part 4 is that a combination product manufacturer also includes contract manufacturers. So one of the common things you'll hear when you go in and you inspect a supplier, let's say your CMO, is that, oh, we're not a manufacturer because we're just a supplier. And it's no, the definition of a combination product manufacturer also includes contract manufacturers. So that's one of the very important distinctions or definitions that the FDA clarified in the compliance program.
Now, I look at this from the same lens as QSIT as an inspection guide. How would you recommend that somebody who hasn't looked at this document look at it? Because I found it to be a little bit more, QSIT's easier to follow from my point of view.
So in the compliance program and all the compliance programs in general, I'll say they cross-reference other ones. So it'll say if it's a device-led combination product, okay, you start here with this compliance program, and then it'll cross-reference the QSID guide, or if it's a drug-led combination product manufacturer inspection, pre-approval inspection specifically, it'll cross-reference the compliance program for drug pre-approval inspections. You are pulling from multiple other inspection techniques as well. So if CDRH is coming in and inspecting a drug-led streamlined approach, but CDRH is coming in to do the Part 4 side of things, they will use their QSID approach in doing the inspection. It's management controls and CAPA in a big bundle, and then it is also design controls and production process controls. So other than production process controls, management controls, design controls, and CAPA, which is really CAPA complaints, recalls, MDRs, and things like that are all within the scope of a Part 4 inspection anyway. So if CDRH is coming in to inspect for the Part 4, the 820 elements, they're going to do it from a QSID standpoint. And one of the things that the QSID guide says, you start with management controls first. And so they're going to do that from a Part 4 inspection as well. And so when I inspect, I do it in that order, because management responsibility is one of the first things you inspect, and that kind of gives you a big picture right there. Does the organization really even understand that they're a combination product manufacturer? Is management on board with that?
You talked a little bit about a clarification that the compliance guide makes around the definition of CMOs. How often in your experience have you seen PAIs extend to a CMO, where FDA is actually boots on the ground at the CMO?
So in the compliance program, it gives some definitions, but it gives a definition of combination product manufacturer, which was already in Part 4, but it adds at the very end, including contract manufacturers. So when I started doing mock pre-approval inspections, including inspecting the suppliers of the sponsor, they were like, we're not a manufacturer. And I'd say, here's the definition in the compliance program. And I would say, all of them,
pretty clear,
honestly, or none of them knew that they were combination product manufacturers. And even so now, it's always this. We're not the sponsor, we're the supplier, and then the sponsor will go, we're not the device manufacturer, they are.
we
And when I
transfer
say
to them.
CMOs, I'm talking about the device manufacturers. Now, when you would go into some of these other CMOs, I'm not going to name names, but who maybe provide solutions, what we'll call. So they sell a container closure solution, like they've already paired up a syringe with a stake needle with a certain plunger and piston and needle safety guard, and they're selling it as a solution or marketing it. That's a combination product, and they don't see themselves that way. They see them as manufacturers of packaging components. So that was new for them. And even co-packagers, your manufacturers who are co-packaging for you, and they're coming up with the packaging and the labeling design. They don't even consider themselves manufacturers, much less combination product manufacturers. They say, oh, well, we're not a manufacturer. We do packaging and labeling.
We're assembling.
Like, oh, packaging and labeling is within the scope of manufacturing. And if you're designing the packaging and the labeling, like you're picking the label stock and the adhesive and the way the layout of the carton and the inserts, now you're designing packaging and labeling. So now design control is in scope as well. So I would say almost 9 times out of 10, they don't know they're a combination product manufacturer.
But then I think I'm trying to translate it practically into what you've seen in terms of there's obviously awareness when it comes to things like mock PAIs, where the concern is making sure that no stone is left unturned prior to or during the submission review time frame. But have you seen FDA go to the CMOs?
Recently, yes. So
They
that was
moved to
the
that.
compliance program came out in 2020, right in the middle of COVID. And so for a good year after that, FDA was doing remote inspections anyway, and it was really risk-based. And then there was a huge backlog where they were catching up. So a lot of times they were doing pre-approval inspections only focused on the drug side of things. So only recently, and I'll say, with the After Wraps Combination Product Conference, they do FDA office hours and you can come in. And so in the office hour I had signed up for, I brought this up and I said, I'm doing mock pre-approval inspections and going to these CMOs, and they're saying, we're not being inspected for this. We're being inspected from just the drug standpoint. So I said to the FDA, I was like, when are you going to start inspecting these CMOs and holding them to these requirements? So I would say only in the past year or so am I starting to see that.
And you had mentioned from the definition, you would also consider like the component manufacturers, like
Depending on how they're marketing it. I'll use Becton Dickinson as an example. Okay, so
let's avoid company names. Call it
no,
big
no, I'm just
syringe
saying from
manufacturer.
what they provide, right?
Sure.
So they can provide a syringe barrel or a plunger or different color plunger rods. But then when a company starts marketing it as all in one, what the drug is and what the fill volume is and what the plunger height needs to be, and now we're going to give you that whole solution.
Yeah,
Now
yeah.
you're a combination product manufacturer, you're not just a packaging component
Yeah,
supplier.
okay, so I understand what you're saying. You're saying in the situations where those combination product or where those primary packaging component manufacturers are going to the length of creating bundles, so to speak, where you have some option to choose from, but you're picking the syringe, the stopper, the backstop, the plunger rod, needle safety device, all of that as a system. You have some choices within those and
Right.
permutations, but you're getting it all in one. Uh-huh. Interesting. Now, you've done a bunch of mock PAIs, some of them maybe before 2020 when this compliance program was made available, others after. Where are the PAI problem areas?
One is just understanding what it means to be a combination product manufacturer, regardless if it's the sponsor or it's the supplier. So understanding what that means, and then FDA's expectations for the call outs beyond what's just in black and white in a regulation. And so a lot of people in the regulatory in the sponsor world in general, people take a regulation at face value in black and white and say, well, where does it say in here this, or where does it say in here that? But it's really the preamble that spells out FDA's expectations for any of these regulations, 211, Part 4, 820. And so that's where you get a good idea of what the FDA's thinking is. So a lot of times these manufacturers, when they're not even clearly understand about being a combination product manufacturer, but they don't understand what the FDA's expectation is on these 820 requirements. In addition, a lot of times drug manufacturers are beyond 211, they use ICH-Q10 to augment, where 211 only really covers manufacturing, GMPs, good manufacturing practices. It doesn't really cover QMS, quality management system. So they use ICH-Q10 to augment that, but ICH-Q10 is a guideline. It's not a regulation. It's not mandatory. So a lot of times they really just think, oh, the main difference with Part 4 is just design control. They brush off management control, supplier controls, CAPA say, we already have that. We use ICH-Q10. Really, it's probably not any different. We just know we need to do design controls. And that's a common misconception. And one of the things I always point out when I do training is, instead of just launching into these are the Part 4 requirements, I say there is a reason why the FDA has called out these 820 requirements, because they're not the same as 211 or ICH-Q10. So I make a point in saying, management controls is not the same as you do under ICH-Q10. Supplier controls is not the same. CAPA is not the same, and here's why. So I would say that's one of the big misconceptions, is that it's not really any different than ICH Q10.
Have you ever had a really poor mock PAI?
But define poor.
Not launch ready?
M- Most, I would
Is that
say.
right? Where specifically within the quality system elements do you find gaps?
So, like,
You mentioned
they don't really, okay, so let's put design control aside for a minute.
sure.
The other elements, like management controls, purchasing controls, CAPA, they haven't done anything beyond what they think is the same as what they currently do for ICH Q10. So if you're familiar with Q10, they talk about management representative and management reviews and things like that. They talk about
Yeah.
CAPA management review under ICH Q10 is much more of a business focus and quality initiatives. It's not really looking at all your data and determining the output of that, what you need to do from a corrective action standpoint, and what are the sources of data that need to go in your management review, which is not necessarily the same as it is under ICH Q10. And that management review is just not an activity just to say you did it. You actually have to take that information, disseminate it through the organization. So a lot of times I'll see it's almost like this private meeting with top management, and it's not really information shared with the rest of the organization. So that's one of the big things, is very kept at the top management level. And if you're not at that level, you really don't even know what's being covered in a management review.
But so let's double click on suppliers maybe, because I think there is some call out in ICH Q10, like you mentioned. Where are the important areas between purchasing controls 820.50 and ICH Q10 that maybe misses or near
So
misses?
I would say one thing, which isn't necessarily just a Q10 thing, but is sponsors understanding what the supplier's responsibilities are within the context of the 820 requirements. So a lot of times you'll see quality agreements or audits or pre-qualification, but the people who are doing them from the sponsor side only understand 211 requirements. So they're not really even clear what the supplier's responsibilities are as it pertains to combination products. So one is just knowing the scope of the supplier and what the requirements are they need to hold them to. The other is the risk-based approach. So really knowing what is the risk associated with that supplier, not just business risk or being able to provide materials on time and just doing an audit once a year, once every 3 years, or not even at all, and just using the quality agreement. So that supplier controls, since so much of combination products from a device standpoint are outsourced to these suppliers, that you really need to put a lot of emphasis on the quality of the materials and the products and the components that these suppliers are providing you. Whereas I think from a drug standpoint, they're receiving packaging components and they're inspecting the packaging components, and then you might purchase raw materials and things like that. But it's not this constant, we need to be inspecting when we see issues. We need to, maybe we need to increase our sampling plan. Maybe we need to add new acceptance criteria. Maybe we need to beef up our supplier agreement. I don't see a lot of that follow-up actions happening.
And I think where I'm trying to dissect here is my read of part 4 is that it's the gaps identified between 820 and 210 to 11 for combination products where there's crossover between two sort of product categories. There are, like, for example, using kappa as an example, kappa is not outlined in, it's outlined in 820, it's not outlined in the CGMPs, the drug
Correct.
FDA CGMPs, but it is outlined in Q10.
Correct.
Suppliers, so purchasing controls is not outlined in the drug CGMPs, but it is outlined in Q10. So
Correct.
is it that difficulty happens that the supplier management quality system element within a sponsor is not making, because just speaking broadly, whether it's drug or device, there's some permutation of audit, quality agreement, regulatory history, management of certifications, like all these things, right? I know supplier management really well. But is it that, for example, sponsors supplier management may not have a combo product category, whether it's combo product kitting
That's another
or
one I see a lot, right? So since
or their quality agreement doesn't speak to Part 4 as an
that as
applicable
well,
regulation,
all of
and
that.
yeah, and so this is I suppose what I'm trying to make clear is where I see a lot of philosophical arguments happen between drug and device folks is like, okay, we're not talking about whether we need an audit because both sides will say we need one. It's just a matter of, did you audit for combination product expectations or not? When you did do the audit, did the quality agreement consider quality agreement when you
Yes,
did the quality agreement? The same
all of
thing
the
with the
above.
supplier file. Yeah, okay.
Yep. So it's the initial qualifying them as a supplier, but again, your supplier management team, your organization, do they understand what the supplier is providing? And packaging component is the term from a drug standpoint. And to a lot of sponsors, these are secondary packaging components that are put in the same category as like a carton or a label. And a lot of times they're just viewing this as off the shelf commodity parts. And especially when it's device components, it's almost like the sponsor says, we don't know, we're not devices. They know what they're doing. And a lot of times they'll just accept on a C of C or C of A and think, we don't need to measure these components. The supplier already measured them, or we don't need to really even inspect anything. We'll just take the C of C. And to even qualify them in the first place, they might do a desktop audit instead of even an on-site audit, or they do the audit. But like I was saying earlier, and one of the requirements under 820.20, not even 820.50, but 820.20,
What's that
maybe
one?
it is 820, sorry,
Which one's 20.20?
management responsibility.
Ah,
But
yeah.
it also says that your auditors need to be trained on what they're responsible for too. So a lot of times you'll see auditors go in and inspect a device component or packaging component supplier to 211. And they don't even understand that that's not really the scope. You need to inspect them to the device regulatory requirements. So I'll see that a lot. Your auditors aren't even trained on the 820 requirements, and they're not auditing to the correct scope. So that's a big one. And now with the QMSR coming into play, management review and supplier audit records can be inspected by the FDA. So I look at supplier audits, or I look at what was the scope of the audit, and that's where I see a lot of times they just miss the mark. And then the supplier quality agreement is written from a drug CMO standpoint, and they don't even have the roles and responsibilities in there from a device standpoint. Who is responsible for the design control? Who's responsible for the risk management? Who's responsible for trending on CMO related nonconformances and failures and complaints for inputs to risk management? None of it's in there. So yeah, so one is even qualifying them for the right thing in the first place, auditing them for the right thing in the first place, inspecting the what you're procuring from them appropriately, and then even outlining in the roles and responsibilities of the quality agreement the device related considerations. And then back to what you were saying a few minutes ago about having a category for them. So that's another big one I see is they bundle the device components under secondary packaging. And so if by default, they have a secondary packaging supplier category, it may not even require any sort of inspection, or it might say a label, inspect one to the artwork, or take on C of C. And they just completely miss the need to actually inspect the materials they're receiving or do a statistical sampling plan and have acceptance criteria. It's just, they take a C of C.
Anything else related to the compliance program that we missed?
I think it more clearly outlines what a contract manufacturer is responsible for as well, so that design control also falls on the contract manufacturer if they're doing design and development. So back to what we were talking about with if a contract manufacturer is selling a solution, a platform as we'll call it, then they're required to have a design history file for that platform. And even though it's drug agnostic, they still designed a platform. And so they're expected to have a design history file for that platform. So again, that's new to the contract manufacturers, where they just see themselves as suppliers, not doing design and development.
Where can people find you, Laurie?
On LinkedIn, Laurie Auerbach, and my organization, my company is Compliance Prodigies, and you can provide my information on the podcast information.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on, Laurie. This was fun.
All right, thank you.
Stop here.